Hey, welcome, everybody. This is to the weekly M-Cube seminar, last one of the year. Today we're having ASP postdoc Kelly Núñez Ocasio. She's a postdoc ASP and sitting with us at M-Cubed. She has a PhD from Penn State, where she worked on mesoscale convective systems, African easterly waves, tropical cyclogenesis, and African weather and climate using both observations and model data. Kelly is an associate editor at Monthly Weather Review and an academic ambassador in the AMS Committee for Hispanic and Latinx Advancement, otherwise known as CHALA. Her recently released open access MCS tracker was used this summer in the NASA CPEX CV and precip field campaigns as a forecasting tool. So today's seminar, the role of water vapor in African easterly wave evolution and tropical cyclogenesis. And Kelly, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to share with you a bit of previous work I've done and how that work has motivated what I'm doing currently here at NCAR related to the role of water vapor in African easterly wave and tropical cyclogenesis. So in the most recent review of tropical cyclogenesis of the World Meteorological Organization, they defined tropical cyclogenesis as a warm core non-frontal synoptic scale cyclone that couples with organized deep convection and has a closed surface wind circulation and a well-defined center. So that synoptic scale cyclone over the Atlantic can be an African easterly wave. So in a very general sense, African easterly waves are westward propagating disturbances over Africa during the northern summer months. And so they can become tropical cyclones. And in learning about African easterly waves, we've greatly understood tropical cyclogenesis. However, there are challenges that remain with this topic. And I think it's mainly two things. The first one is that we have limited understanding of the interactions between the mesoscale processes and the actual tropical cyclone seedling, in this case, an African easterly wave. But adding to the complexity of tropical cyclogenesis is the fact that these interactions are in large part driven by water vapor. And so as we can see here from this animation of total precipitable water, water vapor varies greatly in space and time, especially in the tropics. So our models, they have difficulty trying to resolve these feedbacks between water vapor, convection, and wave. And so that motivated some of my previous work. And I wanted to try to understand if there was a relationship between the large-scale environment over Africa and the likelihood of tropical cyclogenesis in the Atlantic. So we tested this hypothesis that perhaps those African easterly waves that do become tropical cyclone, the developers, they initiate and evolve in a more favorable environment. And so we tested that hypothesis, and it turns out we came out with what we called main key predictors of a possible subsequent tropical cyclogenesis event. So we saw, when compared to the non-developers, that composite of developing systems, so those that do become tropical cyclones, it turns out that over Eastern Africa, the West African monsoon flow was stronger. Yeah, the monsoon can go all the way over Eastern Africa and interact with these waves. In addition, we also saw there was stronger convergence over the Mara Mountains. And these mountains are important because this is where a lot of these African easterly waves initiate, over Ethiopia highlands, Mara. We also saw that there was a larger monsoon moisture and convective signature over Eastern Africa. And over Western Africa, the same thing. A stronger, a more intense active monsoon, but also a more intense and extended African easterly jet. So we're hoping that these key predictors can help the forecaster predict genesis, but it could also help the local forecaster in terms of predicting a rainfall event, for example. We also found some relationship between tropical cyclogenesis likelihood and where these African easterly waves initiate. So it turns out that those waves that initiate over eastern Africa are more likely to become tropical cyclones once they cross the west coast of Africa, more than those that originate over central or western Africa. And so this gave us a perspective on how the large-scale environment relates to genesis, but it really doesn't make things simpler. It turns out that African easterly wave intensity forecasts with low scale are characterized by higher water vapor downstream of the easterly wave trough. And so based on these predictors, it's just telling us that it's very complicated to predict tropical cyclogenesis in a more favorable environment. And so now understanding a little bit more how the large-scale environment over Africa relates to TC genesis, how does the mesoscale convective systems differ between waves that do become tropical cyclones and those that do not? And so that brings me to the other research project. And so in this project, I made use of several tools. The first one is TAMS. It's TAMS for Tracking Algorithm for Mesoscale Convective Systems. This is a MCS tracker developed during my PhD. Quick side note, we have a new version of it up and running. Like Rich mentioned, it was used recently in the field campaigns. And what we did, we took all of these MCS's tracks and we coupled them to an existing easterly wave track data set. Now, I won't go too much into the details, but the idea was to match each MCS, each convective system, to its associated African easterly wave. And in that way, I can understand how the MCSs in a wave relative framework differ with both types of easterly waves. And I'll go over the results of this work with this diagram right here. And the main result was that the chances of tropical cyclogenesis increased with appropriate convective coupling. So what I'm showing you here on the left is what we found for developing systems. So we actually found that the convection of developing waves, so the wave being identified here as that inverted trough, that triangle in black, we found that the convection was more likely to be in the same location of the trough. That was true over the eastern Atlantic and also over land. But for the non-developers, it turns out that convection was more likely to move south of the trough, so out of phase with that trough. Not only that, we found when looking at the phase speed of the wave was that the convection of developers was also more likely to be moving at the same speed of the trough, whereas for the non-developers, the convection was always moving slightly ahead, so completely out of phase with that African easterly wave. And so the findings of this work led me to propose a linkage between tropical cyclogenesis and back then in 2018, the recently developed Moisture Vortex Instability by Angela Dames, which by this point you are familiar with. And so the idea was that, as Adames explains, in this instability, you have moisture and temperature being advected towards the center of the circulation through the wave winds, and that creates a favorable thermodynamic environment in which convection can grow, and through vortex stretching, intensify the system. So it's really a mechanism that helps you explain the water vapor convection wave feedback. And I thought it gave a 3D picture of what actually could be happening to African easterly waves that develop into tropical cyclones. And so with all of these ideas, I come to NCAR to try and not revisit the theory, but rather try and see if I can apply theories such as moisture vortex instability or moisture mode as diagnostic tools and see if they can help me understand tropical cyclogenesis. So before going into the results, let me go quickly over these theories. So we just talked about moisture vortex instability. Another theory that I look into is moisture mode. Again, we've heard about that recently with our recent M-Cube speakers. And this theory has been around for a longer while. And it's defined in different ways. For example, Raymond and Fuchs, who was here recently, they define a moisture mode as when precipitation is a strongly increasing function of saturation fraction, and when convection acts to increase the saturation fraction. And so when using saturation fraction to define a moisture mode, Raymond and Fuchs allow for both temperature and moisture to vary in the system. But more recently, Ángel Adames and his group, Victor and Maita, have listed a set of criteria in order to test whether or not a system is a moisture mode. And their definition of it is a little bit more restrictive. So they say the moisture anomalies of the system must be correlated with precipitation anomalies. The weak temperature gradient balance must be dominating the temperature changes. So in other words, the latent heat back convection is sparse out through gravity waves. And then finally, moisture controls the thermodynamics of the system. So in this definition, Adames and his team are a little bit more restrictive. They don't allow for temperature changes. And what I do is I take in consideration, again, all of these definitions and try to see if they're applicable to tropical cyclogenesis. And before I move further, I want to say, I'm not saying that dry dynamics aren't important in tropical cyclogenesis. We know that baroclinic and barotropic instability have really helped shape our understanding of easterly waves and subsequently of tropical cyclogenesis. What I'm trying to do here, and the rest of the speakers as well so far, I think is we're trying to incorporate water vapor now in tropical variability and in genesis. So I came to NCAR with this very general hypothesis, thinking that now knowing that developing systems propagate over Africa in a favorable environment, that could be translating to the actual local environment between wave and convection and could aid genesis. So very general hypothesis. And so the goal of the work was to use NPAS to simulate tropical cyclogenesis from an African easterly wave, and then investigate the role of moisture in the mechanisms that lead to the genesis of a particular case. So I've been looking at Hurricane Helene from back in 2006. And I'll focus mainly on the second aspect of this project here. So let me go over the model configuration. So NPAS was initialized using both the ECMWF integrated forecast system and the NCEP global forecast system. The idea behind this was to understand which initial conditions were better fit to understand easterly wave and genesis. We integrated the model for 5 days and 6 hours, so just around the time where the wave was over Central and Western Africa and during its time over Eastern Atlantic, just to capture that transition during tropical cyclogenesis. We used a global 15-kilometer grid and 27 vertical levels. So here I am showing you the track of pre-Helene. So I manually track this wave using 700 hectopascal meridional wind. We also used an automated tracker. It turns out they were pretty similar. And I am showing you in magenta, arrow 5. So MPAS initialized with GFS in blue, MPAS initialized with IFS in orange, and then the best track here in the red stars. And so I'll briefly go through what we see here. And so initially, the initialization started when the wave was over the Joe's Plateau. The track was very bumpy. This was true also for Arrow 5. Once it goes over Western Africa, we see that all tracks converge. But as the system moves off the West Coast into the Atlantic waters, we see that the simulation initialized with IFS actually converges better to the observed track than the one initialized with MPAS GFS. So now let's look at some Hofmullers. Here I'm showing you on the left column the rainfall rate Hofmuller. And so on the top is IMERG, middle MPAS GFS, and in the bottom MPAS IFS. On the right column, I am showing you in shade the relative humidity at 700 hectopascal, and the solid counters are relative vorticity at that level. So we're seeing that MPAS using 15-kilometer grid parametrization of convection is able to reproduce the rainfall footprint of this particular case when compared to IMERG. We also see that it's able to reproduce the overall intensity of the wave when we look at the Hofmuller of the relative vorticity. Now, a few details here. Note that the MPAS GFS simulation had a more moisture-rich environment overall when compared to Arrow 5 and MPAS IFS. And we also see a more intense easterly wave for the MPAS GFS. Now, what's interesting is that the average phase speed of the wave was a little bit different across the data sets. So for Arrow 5, it was about 7.7 meters per second. For MPAS GFS was 5.1 meters per second. And for MPAS IFS, 6.4 meters per second. These all are under African easterly wave average speeds, however, on the lower end. And so that was the first hint that perhaps this case could be a slowly evolving system, which is a characteristic of moisture modes. So we also looked at the boundary layer, and this quantity here that I'm showing you, I'm calling it net moisture flux, is really just an analogous to your moisture flux convergence equation. And so what we're seeing is that the negative values represent moisture flux towards the center of the circulation. So the more negative, the more moisture input towards the center of the circulation. And so the solid lines is this quantity between 1,000 and 850 hectopascal, so around the boundary layer, and then the dashed lines at the mid-levels. And so what we're seeing that it was true in Arrow 5, but most definitely in the models, is that this quantity increased as the system moved towards West Africa and into tropical cyclogenesis. So we see this drop in the solid magenta Arrow 5, again an increase in moisture flux towards the center, and it's definitely true for the simulations, both the orange and blue lines. And so this relates to the vertical profile of the system, and we'll see that next. It turns out that when we specifically look at the vertical mass flux of Arrow 5, so the magenta line, we see that it follows the literature. We see that it follows Raymond's literature, where the profile goes from a top-heavy vertical mass flux profile to a bottom-heavy at the time of genesis. So again, just focusing on the magenta profile. But if we look at the simulation, what are the differences? So we're actually seeing that the simulations show what we're calling a double peak type of profile. So both the bottom heavy and top heavy aspects of the profiles are strong and are competing. And so we tried to look more into the details of that. And it turns out that we utilize a TC Genesis tracker. And it so happens that in the simulations, the TC Genesis window occurred earlier than in Era 5 or the observed time. And so we were trying to relate that TC Genesis in the simulation being earlier, perhaps being more efficient, it translates to a more stabilized type of structure. Now, I was just in Albany, and Robert Fravel was telling me, so could that top-heavy profile be important for Genesis or not? And it's still in my head. Could this just be an artifact of the model, or could it be just the fact that it was a more intense system overall from the start in the simulations when compared to Era 5? And so we see that top-heavy profile throughout the times that the system is close to Genesis during, based on the observed Genesis. So reviewing a little bit, we saw that boundary layer moisture flux was important in the Genesis. It was an increasing quantity up to the point it became a tropical depression. And we also saw that it translated through the vertical mass flux profile of the system. It was true in Era 5, and to some extent, it was true in the model. But the model experienced a more faster tropical cyclogenesis, and as we'll see here, a more intense one. So here I am showing you in shade column saturation fraction. So this is a bird view, a wave relative centered bird view, where the blue streamlines are the 850 hectopascal total wind, and the red streamlines are the 500 hectopascal total winds. And so time is increasing downward. The first column is Era 5, the second column is MPAS GFS, and the third column is MPAS IFS. So it turns out that Raymond showed that when boundary layer moisture flux increases, it directly relates to the intensity of the low-level circulation. And so we believe we see this here as well. We see that the circulation in blue is intense hours prior to the observed tropical cyclogenesis. This was true in Era 5 and definitely true in the simulation for both MPAS GFS and MPAS IFS. Another thing I want to point out here is the fact that the 500 hectopascal the total winds, become more and more aligned with the 850 hectopascal circulation. Now, this was definitely true in the simulation. We see how that upper level circulation was closed when compared to the more open type of structure in Era 5. It was closed in both simulations, and it was more intense throughout, more vertically aligned structure than in Era 5. But we do see that across all data sets, this becomes more and more aligned, both the 500 and 850 hectopascal, as the system approaches tropical cyclogenesis. So it's the first step of moisture vortex instability, a vertical alignment. Now, what we see in Era 5 is that the most saturated air was closely co-located with the 850 hectopascal circulation. And this air was being advected towards the center of the circulation. And we could see that augmented again in the simulation. So we could see how that very saturated air, the darker shades, is being advected in the southeast quadrant towards the center of the circulation. So in other words, the more intense the system gets, the more saturated the air becomes at the center of the circulation. So another characteristic of a moisture mode based on Raymond and Fuchs' definition. And so if we think about moisture vortex instability, and we think that in the definition, he's saying that temperature and moisture are both increasing at the center, aligning with both circulations, then perhaps we could say that this also happened for this particular case. And we could use potentially moisture vortex instability as a diagnostic tool. And just to convince you further, we could see that the outgoing long wave radiation here on the right is the coldest cloud tops are co-located with the most saturated air in the simulations. Now the rainfall is a little bit more tricky. So here I am plotting rainfall rates for iMerge, and Arrow 5 is the blue streamlines. And although they don't co-locate two different data sets, it is true that the rainfall is closely located with the center of the circulation. But we see that in the simulation, it is true that the rainiest portions of the system are right at the center of the circulation. And so it is also true that wherever it's raining, it's where the air is most saturated, excuse me. But something that's interesting here is that where it's not true that wherever is most saturated, it is raining. So that's a case for both the simulations and Arrow 5. And I think that is key for the next thing that I will show you, which is I'm actually going to test whether or not this particular wave was a moisture mode. So I go over the definition or the criteria as defined by Adamus and his group to test whether or not Helene is the moisture mode. So going back on Raymond's and Fuchs' definition, precipitation was following the most saturated air based on saturation fraction. Now let's see if moisture anomalies correlate with precipitation anomalies. When we calculate that, only the simulations, MPAS simulation, satisfied that condition. When the second criterion is that the weak temperature gradient balance must be dominating the temperature changes. This was actually true across all data sets. When testing if moisture controls the thermodynamics of the system, this was actually not true for any of the data sets. But Adamus does explain that there's another way that we can test this condition by using the N mode, which effectively it makes use of the phase speed of the wave. And when we do that, remember that the wave was propagating at a slower speed. It turns out that it does satisfy the condition of being a moisture mode. There's other ways of calculating this quantity. It turns out, again, only the simulations satisfy the condition. So what are the results? I am showing you here that some properties are satisfied based on the definition of Adamus and his group. Some are not. Based on Raymond's and Fuchs' definition, we could say that it is a slowly evolving moisture mode. So what is the conclusion? What we were testing was not whether or not to say this case was a moisture mode, but rather, can it help explain the evolution, the tropical cyclogenesis? Well, I'm an optimistic person, and I say potentially, but more research is needed. This is only one case. So this is what I'm proposing here. I'm proposing that this particular case, pre-Helene, was a mixed off-equatorial moisture mode that initiated over Western Africa and evolved under weak temperature gradient. So what does this mean? I think what it means is that we definitely see moisture was playing a role in this case, but temperature was also an important factor. So we cannot discard it. And that's why I added that mix in that proposal, because both temperature and moisture are important. But it turns out that the idea is that as the system approaches more and more the west coast of Africa and the Atlantic waters, it becomes more of a moisture mode. And so water vapor begins to be a more and more important factor in the evolution of the system. And so with that idea, we're proposing a tropical cyclogenesis pathway. And the first step of this pathway is that a type of mixed equatorial moisture mode evolves under weak temperature gradient. It's initiated over Western Africa. So where we have sufficient wave MCS interaction, enough monsoon moisture and convection that interacts with the wave, and water vapor becomes a more dominant factor. Once that is attained, then it aids boundary layer net moisture flux, which increases towards the center of the wave, as we saw in the results. And that enables mass and vorticity convergence. So it stabilizes the system in the vertical. And then with that vertical alignment, we can invoke moisture vortex instability, and subsequently the tropical cyclogenesis, the system becomes a tropical depression. And so very briefly summarizing this part, we tested this idea that perhaps moisture is playing a more significant role in the genesis of easterly waves specific for this case study, and we found these three main key results. First of all, boundary layer moisture flux into the wave is key in Helene's tropical cyclogenesis. We saw that the tropical cyclogenesis was in part moisture-driven, and we saw that convection was co-located with the wave vortex. So again, invoking moisture vortex instability, and we saw that that happened even hours before the actual tropical cyclogenesis as defined by the forecaster. Results suggest that pre-Helene could be characterized as a type of off-equatorial moisture mode as it reaches the West African coast and the Eastern Atlantic waters. And so with the remainder of my time here, I'm going to go over a little bit on kind of wrapping up the talk so far, giving you some broader impacts and implications. And then in the last minutes, I want to go over some more recent work I've been doing here at NCAR. So based on the results and what I've worked so far, I believe that we know for a fact that with the changing climate, we're going to have more water vapor in the atmosphere, but I don't think that necessarily means that we're going to have more moisture-driven tropical cyclogenesis or African easterly wave evolutions. I think there is something to say about the intensity of these systems, but especially for easterly waves, we cannot discard temperature changes. In terms of predicting tropical cyclogenesis, I think that it's become increasingly clear with my research, but with other folks as well, is the phasing between MCS and the African easterly wave trough. We see that this is true during genesis, but we see that this is true even over land. The key large-scale predictors can help inform and add days of predictability for tropical cyclogenesis. And I think that forecasters could make use of boundary layer net moisture flux, whatever form of equation. I think it's a key tool for tropical cyclogenesis forecast. And finally, moisture vortex instability. I think at this point I'm more convinced that it could be a more suitable diagnostic tool than moisture mode when trying to understand the genesis of a hurricane. And so with that, I'm going to go over my most recent work. I'm working with Chris Davis on this, and this is the same case, so Hurricane Helene. But now I am looking into explicitly resolved deconvection simulations. And so there's still so many unanswered questions. And what I'm doing is I'm taking a limited area from NPAS and really trying to alter the water vapor over this region. So I'm doing some sensitivity, moisture sensitivity experiments and trying to understand how that translates to the evolution of the wave, but also to the genesis. So what I'm doing is I have a control run, and then I rank up the relative humidity by 20%, and then I dry out by 50%. And I do this for initial and lateral boundary conditions everywhere in the model. And then I just let it run and see what happens. And so, as expected, you see that compared to control and dry, moist simulation has more rainfall overall. So this is the time mean rainfall rate over the simulated period. And then rain in dry was, well, the least amount. I'm also looking at the evolution of the actual wave itself. So now comparing what happens to dry and moist with control. So again, I have the rainfall rate, Hofmüller, and the relative vorticity and relative humidity in shade. And it turns out that there's interesting features here in the moist, but something that we were looking into is the fact that for the moist, you could see more of a defined transition between wave to tropical cyclone, which we're going to look into compared to control and dry. I thought it was interesting when tracking the wave in each experiment is that even though the dry wasn't raining, I was actually able to track the wave from the start. So something to say about those dry dynamics. Again, it turns out that the moist experiment has a slower, very slow pre-Helene and a more intense system when compared to dry and control. I started to look at what is the total diabatic heating rate. So here on the left column, I'm showing you a vertical profile with time on the X. And the middle is the diabatic tendencies for microphysics. And on the right one is for the boundary layer scheme. And so it turns out that African easterly waves are, for the most part, top-heavy types of structures, as we see here. So I'm just trying to identify here some of the differences that I'm seeing. For example, the boundary layer for the dry, we could see had a much more active diurnal cycle, stronger when compared to the moist and the control, which relates to the fact that there is less cloudiness overall. And in looking at the actual cloud processes, if you look at it for a long time, as I've been doing recently, it turns out that the moist simulation has a particularly more vertically uniform diabatic heating rate. So I'm trying to understand what is that about. And when I look at a wave composite of the microphysics in shade and the meridional wind in the counters, it turns out that ahead of the wave, the control has a more top-heavy profile than the moist. And so in trying to figure out what's going on here, I'm relating these top-heavy profiles to the type of cloud. So my working hypothesis so far is that perhaps in the moist simulation, there is a higher fraction of deep convection, but in the control, you have a higher fraction of stratiform convection, so relating to that top-heavy profile. But that's still in the works. And something that's interesting is that it turns out that the moist simulation, probably not as surprising, has less vertical moisture gradients than the control. So the control has a stronger moisture gradient co-located with that top-heavy heating profile. So something to say about moisture gradients, and perhaps going back to understanding the moisture budget across these experiments could help elucidate the role of moisture in this evolution. And so just quickly going over the working hypothesis, I believe that there is some differences between the type of cloud across the experiments, especially between moist and control. I'm working with Chris Davis now to see whether or not that relates to the vertical mass flux and the vertical velocities, but also trying to understand a little bit better the phase speed of the wave and how it relates to water vapor. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I get any questions.
Okay, the paper's open for questions or comments.
Quick comment. So if I understand correctly, this moist and dry, you simply change the initial conditions and boundary conditions. Mm-hmm. You didn't mess up with surface fluxes, which is, of course, for the lower troposphere, the biggest source of the moisture.
Right.
Over the ocean especially. So I'm curious whether, whether you look at how that affects surface fluxes, because I think that might be quite important.
Yeah.
For
no,
your
that's
argument.
a good point. I'm just modulating the relative humidity from 1,000 hectopascal up to the highest level of the model.
And then at the boundary.
At the boundary layers.
But not the surface flux.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. You used the GFS and IFS focus. Did you look at how those two models did with this particular case? Are they comparable to what you see in MPAS?
Yeah, I did look a little bit on it. MPAS tends to be more comparable to what IFS, the IFS plots looked much more similar to the MPAS IFS simulation than the GFS one. And it's interesting how, I don't have an answer to it, why the GFS was more moist overall. But yeah, I don't have a straight answer to it, but it could be related with what was going on at the surface and the interactions, especially because the timing that I used to initiate the simulation, the wave was over topography, and I think IFS handled that a little bit more better than GFS, but I would have to look at that.
Thanks, Kelly. Is the moisture vortex instability more or less the same as the pouch theory?
That's a question that I always get everywhere. And I say to some extent, yes, it is, but I like to think about moisture vortex instability as the 3D representation of the pouch. I think the pouch has been good at letting us know where potential eye could develop, right? It tells you, okay, this location is good to become a closed circulation. With moisture vortex instability, I think it provides a mechanism, a 3D understanding of why it is that is true, that at the center of the circulation, it's favorable for an eye to develop. So yeah, I think they're related, but I see moisture vortex instability more applicable because it gives me a more thermodynamic, physical understanding of what I'm seeing, rather than just telling me this is the juicy place for Genesis, if that makes sense.
Kelly, back on the comparison of the simulations initialized with GFS and IFS with ERA. One thing that struck me is in the analysis, it looked like there was some vertical shear persistent, and it looked like very little of that was happening in the simulations. And I wonder if that, first of all, if that's true, if that dramatically changes the nature of the evolution. I suspect it would, and make cyclogenesis more robust and sooner in the model simulation. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I didn't look at the shear, but I think it's a good idea to look at now with the resolved deep convection and see if that also plays a role in the vertical mass flux. Yeah.
questions or comments further? Sure.
So this is related to Vortex question. Like the Sahel region is a soil atmosphere, soil moisture rainfall coupling hotspot globally. Like this is more generally. Like, do you think the soil moisture atmosphere interactions can play an important role in cyclogenesis?
I think so. And especially going back in more of my previous work, you know, when I worked on those differences between developing, you know, those systems that become hurricanes and those that don't, the fact is that when the monsoon is more active, it penetrates further northward in the continent. So this moisture input and this convection can penetrate further inland. There's a lot more interaction with the surface, but I think it aids the developing systems. The coupling is more efficient because the background state is more favorable. So yeah, I think that the soil moisture interactions are key here, especially as we see that the ones that do become hurricanes are more likely to be initiated over Eastern Africa. So they spend more time interacting with the soil and the moisture across the continent before actually becoming tropical cyclones. So yeah, definitely.
I have a question, a clarification. If you go, like, it goes back to your middle of your seminar about the moisture mode instability. You were pointing out the results from the models showing moisture and the low almost co-located.
With the what? I'm sorry.
The moisture and the low.
Co-located, yeah.
But the little cartoon shows that the convection is out ahead of, it leads the low.
Well, so.
Am I misunderstanding?
No, you're right. The fact is that in moisture vortex, where as long as the convection is within the large scale circulation, even if it's a little ahead or behind, it'll be good. But in terms of like stretching,
In terms of propagation.
yeah. But my point with it being on top of the wave is that it cannot be too, if the convection is too ahead in the southerlies, then it's not interacting with the circulation any longer. So as long as that convection is within the large scale circulation, it'll do good to the overall wave. But
So
once it's
it-
outside of it, that's
okay.
when it gets,
Right.
yeah. So yeah, if I don't know if I'm being clear here. So it's still, the cloud is still within the circulation, right?
Okay, so it doesn't matter that it's on one side or another.
I don't think so. No, as long as it's within the circulation, it's still providing vortex stretching and intensification. Once it's outside of the trough, which is what I saw like in my previous work, that's when then it's not favorable for the wave.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting work, Kelly. I have a two-part question. So when you're comparing I think it's the moisture saturation fraction, right? Are those plots, is the system still within land or over ocean? And if it is over ocean, how can you separate Vichy mechanism from the moisture
Right.
mode, right? So because the moisture is not conserved. So I recall you mentioned about moisture transport into the inner core region, but what about surface exchange? So yeah,
Right.
that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah. So the more relative, the more significant difference in the tracks was that the MPAS GFS was moving slower. So ERA 5 and MPAS IFS made it to the coast before the MPAS GFS, and I think that was a difference of 6 hours. So in the track was like 2 points. So yeah, there is a change in how the saturation fraction across the Atlantic versus land. I didn't look too much into that detail, but rather more of the evolution of how they compared with ERA 5. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm actually looking more into that on the resolved deep convection simulations and how it relates to the evolution.
Okay, that's about it. We'll reconvene at the coffee pot, and thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you.